They said family comes first, unless you're the daughter they'd rather forget. 2 nights before New Year's Eve, my father called just to say, "It'll be your sister and her family this year, we're keeping it private." I didn't fight, I didn't beg. While they toasted champagne in their mansion, I was under the lights of Times Square, hosting CNN's live countdown for millions, raising money for the people they never saw. At 12:01, my phone lit up with 87 missed calls. All from him. I'm Claire Monroe, and this is how I turned exile into my loudest revenge. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, yet don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. They said family comes first, unless you're the daughter they'd rather forget. 2 nights before New Year's Eve, my father called just to say, "It'll be your sister and her family this year, we're keeping it private." I didn't fight, I didn't beg. While they toasted champagne in their mansion, I was under the lights of Times Square, hosting CNN's live countdown for millions, raising money for the people they never saw. At 12:01, my phone lit up with 87 missed calls, all from him. I'm Claire Monroe, and this is how I turned exile into my loudest revenge. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Snow drifted across the empty street outside my office window, catching the glow of Denver's streetlights and turning the city into a blur of quiet gold. The clock on the wall had just ticked past 10 p.m., and the only sound left in the Aurora Foundation office was the soft rhythm of my fingers against the keyboard. Year-end numbers, donations, projections. Each figure felt heavier than it should. My coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The photo beside my laptop. Mom smiling softly. Victoria, with that effortless confidence, stared back at me like a reminder of everything I'd left behind. The phone on my desk started to vibrate. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen for months. Dad. I stared at it until the ring almost stopped before swiping to answer. Claire, his voice said, dry, distant, and unmistakably sober in its cruelty. "Just your sister and her family this New Year's Eve. We're keeping it private this year." I could hear the faint clink of ice against glass, the hum of his television in the background. There was no emotion in his tone, no hesitation, just the practiced indifference of a man who had built his life around exclusion. For a moment, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictably familiar. "Perfect," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I have my own party that night." A pause, a soft exhale of confusion on his end. Then that same patronizing chuckle. "Good luck with your charity thing." And then the line went dead. I sat there, the hum of the heater filling the silence he left behind. My reflection stared back at me in the dark window, tired eyes half smile, the faintest trace of a tremor in my hand. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to cry or defend myself, just calm. The voice inside me whispered, "This time, you don't have to ask permission to exist." I placed the phone face down and turned back to my laptop. On the screen, an unread email from earlier that day blinked at the top of my inbox. Subject, CNN confirms. Countdown for Hope hosting invitation. My breath caught. Even after reading it twice that morning, seeing those words again still made my chest tighten. I clicked it open. "Dear Ms. Monroe, we're thrilled to confirm your participation in CNN's annual Countdown for Hope broadcast on December 31st live from our New York studio. We believe your foundation's work aligns perfectly with the event's mission, raising funds for the homeless during the New Year's Eve celebration." My fingers hovered above the mouse, scrolling through the list of other hosts, names I'd watched on television since I was a kid. Actors, politicians, business leaders, and now me. The girl who'd once eaten peanut butter sandwiches in a freezing apartment, while her father toasted champagne at the family's country club. I closed my eyes, letting the hum of the city outside fill the room. Last year came rushing back. The New Year's Eve I'd spent sitting alone in a cheap cafe off Colfax Avenue. I'd watched the TV above the counter show my family's smiling faces at the Denver Country Club charity dinner. Victoria dazzling as always, Dad shaking hands with donors. The waitress had refilled my coffee 3 times without asking. I'd told her I was working late. This year would be different. I pushed back from the desk and walked to the window. Snowflakes melted against the glass, catching the glow from the buildings downtown. Somewhere out there, the people I'd built this foundation for were still sleeping in cars and shelters under bridges. The idea that this broadcast could bring them something, money, safety, hope, felt like a quiet form of justice. My reflection stared back at me, the same features that mirrored his, but shaped by something he could never understand. Resilience. I whispered to the glass. I don't need a seat at your table anymore. Outside, the city lights shimmered as if they'd heard me. I stood there until the heater clicked off, and the office went still, a silent promise blooming somewhere deep inside. This time, my voice would be heard, even if he never listened again. Bloomington, Indiana, 1998. The Monroe house smelled like pine and cinnamon, the kind of warmth that never reached me. The chandeliers shimmered jazz played from the old stereo, and the grown-ups laughed over champagne and shrimp cocktails. I remember the gold of the lights, and the way they danced across the marble floor like everything in that house had learned to shine except me. Dad stood near the fireplace, tall and confident, a glass of bourbon in one hand. His voice carried over the music. To another year of success, he said. And to my daughter Victoria, who just got accepted into the State Youth Symphony. Guests applauded. He turned to her, smiling like she was a trophy. My girl deserves the best. Then, in front of everyone, he fastened a pearl necklace around her neck. The pearls caught the light perfectly. I stood in the corner, hands folded behind my back, wearing a dress that used to be hers. The hem was a little too long. Mom glanced at me and smiled, the kind of smile that tried to apologize for things she couldn't change. When the applause died down, Dad finally turned toward me. He reached into the pile of wrapped boxes beside him and pulled out a small flat one. And for Claire, he said like an afterthought, "A notebook, so you can write what you want. If you don't say it out loud, at least you can write it down." Everyone laughed politely. I nodded, holding the leather journal against my chest. It smelled like glue and something faintly metallic. Victoria walked by and whispered, "At least it won't go out of style." That night, I sat on the floor of my room, tracing the cover with my finger. The music from downstairs had faded, replaced by the low murmur of my parents cleaning up. The laughter was gone. I opened the first page but didn't know what to write. The lamp flickered. When I was 12, I believed silence was safety. I thought if I didn't make noise, if I didn't take up space, he'd forget to be disappointed in me. But in that house, even silence had a ranking. A week later, my science teacher called home to tell them I'd been chosen to represent the school in the regional science fair. I came home running breathless, clutching the permission slip, like proof that I was finally enough. Dad was sitting in the living room reading the paper, his tie loosened. I blurted, "Dad, I got selected." "They want me to—" He didn't look up. "That's nice. Your sister needs the car at 6. Take her to her piano practice." I froze, the words drying up in my throat. Victoria looked at me from the staircase, smirking. "Don't make me late," she said. The ride to the music hall was quiet except for the radio. She hummed to herself, tapping the rhythm on her knees. When we pulled up, she turned to me and said, "Dad says you're too sensitive. Maybe if you smiled more, he'd notice you." Then she got out and shut the door. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, watching her walk into the bright glass building, everyone greeting her by name. My reflection in the windshield looked smaller than I remembered. That night I came home to find Dad in the kitchen pouring another drink. Mom was loading the dishwasher. "Your teacher called," he said without looking up. "Said you're going to some science thing." I nodded, waiting for him to say more. He didn't. He turned to Victoria instead. "You did great today, sweetheart. That piece you played. Your mother told me you made the whole hall quiet." I stood there invisible again. He glanced at me briefly. "Don't forget to take the trash out." I walked upstairs and shut the door before the tears came. Later that night I heard their voices through the floorboards. Dad's deep and certain, Victoria's soft and eager. "You're the one I can count on," he said. "You're the one who'll make this family proud." I lay there staring at the ceiling, every word settling into me like stones. Around midnight, I switched on my bedside lamp and opened the notebook. The first page was still blank. I took a breath, picked up my pen, and wrote in uneven, shaky letters, "One day I'll make them read my name." The ink bled through the paper a little, like it was trying to dig its way deeper. I closed the book, set it beside my pillow, and turned off the light. Downstairs, the grandfather clock struck 12. The house went still except for the faint sound of wind brushing against the windows. I pulled the blanket over my head and whispered the words again just to hear them out loud. "One day." The letter came in a thin, white envelope with the University of California, Berkeley seal in the corner. I held it under the kitchen light, my hands shaking so hard I could barely open it. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it already knew what was inside. When I saw the word congratulations, I let out a laugh that startled even me. Mom was standing by the sink drying dishes. I handed her the letter and she pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes bright. "Claire, honey, you did it," she whispered. Dad was at the table, the newspaper spread in front of him like a shield. I waited for him to look up. He didn't. "Berkeley," he said flatly, not lifting his eyes. "That's in California." "You're not serious." "I got a full scholarship," I said. "Tuition, housing, everything. They want me in the environmental engineering program." He folded the paper once, set it down, and finally looked at me. His eyes were tired sharp, the same gray as mine. "Scholarships don't pay for failure." The words hit like a slap. Mom tried to step in. "Richard, she earned this. It's an incredible opportunity." He sighed as if the room itself had disappointed him. "You don't belong out there, Claire. You don't know how the world works. Berkeley's not a fairy tale where hard work makes you special. You'll get eaten alive." I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Then I'll let them choke." He looked at me for a long second, something between disbelief and irritation crossing his face. "You always were too proud for your own good. I learned it from you," I said, and left the room. 2 weeks later, I stood at the door before dawn with an old suitcase and a bus ticket. The air was sharp, the sky still black. Snow crunched under my boots as I dragged the suitcase down the steps. Mom stood in the doorway, her robe pulled tight, tears in her eyes. She didn't say anything, just waved weakly. I think she wanted to tell me she was proud, but couldn't with him upstairs. I nodded, pretending not to notice. The taxi pulled away, tires hissing on frozen pavement. I looked back once and saw the faint light from her window, the only thing in that house that ever felt like love. I didn't know if I was running toward freedom or just away from them. Maybe both. California smelled different. The first thing I noticed was the salt in the air, the brightness of the sky. Berkeley's campus looked like another planet compared to Indiana's flat fields, palm trees, students with confidence so effortless it felt rehearsed. I was the girl with thrift store shoes and a second-hand laptop that crashed every hour. My dorm room was barely big enough for a bed and a desk. My roommate, a pre-law student from San Diego, looked at my suitcase and said, "That's all you brought." I smiled. It's all I need. That first semester nearly broke me. I worked nights at the library, cleaning tables, stacking books, falling asleep on the bus back to campus. I lived on ramen noodles and stale bagels. But every morning when the sun hit the red brick buildings, I told myself I was still standing, and that had to count for something. One afternoon, my professor stopped me after class. "You're the one with the water filtration concept, right? The one using recycled biomaterials?" I nodded, heart pounding. "Good work," he said. "You should submit it to the regional tech fair. They're looking for environmental innovation. You might actually win." That night, I called home not to ask permission, just to share the news. Dad didn't answer. Mom picked up on the third ring. "That's wonderful, Claire," she said softly. "I'll tell your father." I waited for the call back that never came. Weeks passed. I joined a small research group, staying up late in the lab soldering wires and testing prototypes. Sometimes, when everyone else left, I'd write in the notebook Dad gave me years ago. The pages smelled faintly of dust and ink. Freedom isn't when you leave. It's when you stop fearing the way home might break you again. I didn't know if I believed it yet, but writing it made it feel true. The project took months. There were nights the lab heater broke, and we worked in our coats, our breath visible in the cold air. I learned how to make coffee so strong it could strip paint, how to fail a dozen times before something worked. The day we finally filtered clean water through the prototype, I laughed so hard I cried. It worked, my teammate shouted. I wanted to call home again to hear Dad say he was proud, but I already knew how that conversation would end. I walked across campus that evening with the letter from the regional board in my pocket. "You've been selected to present your project at the Western Environmental Innovation Conference." The sunset was spilling orange light across the San Francisco Bay. Students hurried past me laughing, calling out dinner plans. I stood by the railing, the wind cold against my face, and unfolded the letter again. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like a guest in someone else's story. I whispered into the wind, step 1. Step. Somewhere far away in that big house in Indiana. I imagined my father reading the morning paper, never realizing his silence had just turned into my fuel. Denver, 2013. The city was still half asleep under a crust of early snow. When I unlocked the door to the third-floor office, I could barely afford. The walls were cracked. The radiator groaned like an old man, and the lights flickered every time someone turned on the microwave in the hallway. It didn't matter. To me, it was freedom with bad wiring. I'd sold the patent for the water filtration prototype the previous summer, enough money to pay off my student loans, buy a second-hand car, and sign the lease for this place. I called it the Aurora Impact Foundation. The name came from the word dawn. After all the years of being told what I couldn't do, I wanted to build something that made morning possible for other people. There were 3 of us in that office, me, a part-time intern named Maya, and an older accountant who still used a flip phone. We didn't have investors, we didn't have donors, we barely had furniture. But every morning I came in early, fixed the leaky pipe under the sink, and wrote grant proposals at a desk that tilted slightly to the left. I started the foundation to help women in science and to fund small community projects, especially for young girls who thought dreams required permission slips. Every night I stayed past midnight drafting emails to people who would never answer. Sometimes I'd pause to look out the frosted window. The glow from the street lamps blurred into halos, and for the first time, I felt like I was standing in my own kind of light. One Tuesday afternoon, I heard footsteps in the hallway, then a knock. When I opened the door, a woman in her late 50s stood there wrapped in a thick wool coat and holding a folded copy of the Denver Tribune. "Claire Monroe?" she asked. "Yes," I said, straightening my sweater. "You must be lost. The real nonprofits are on the second floor." She laughed, warm and husky. "No, I'm right where I need to be." She handed me the newspaper. "You wrote this, didn't you?" "The Light of Opportunity." I looked down. It was a short op-ed I'd written about social entrepreneurship, something I never thought anyone outside a local coffee shop would read. The woman smiled. "My name's Eleanor Pierce. 30 years at CNN. Retired, sort of. I used to chase stories about people who turned pain into something brighter. I think you're one of those stories." I blinked. "CNN? Are you sure you have the right person? We don't even have a proper printer here." She looked around at the peeling paint, the mismatched chairs, the sticky note that said, "Buy more coffee." "Yeah," she said. "This looks exactly like the start of something real." We sat by the window, steam rising from 2 paper cups of coffee. Outside, flakes of snow drifted down lazy and soft. Eleanor leaned forward. "You talk about light like it's a thing you can build. You ever thought about how silence can be light, too?" I frowned. "Silence. People think you need to shout to change things," she said. "But sometimes silence, when it's earned, becomes a statement all its own." I learned that after 3 decades of covering noise. I nodded, not quite understanding yet, but something about her calmness made me listen harder. She looked at the notebook sitting on my desk. "You keep that with you always," I said. "My dad gave it to me when I was 12. Eleanor smiled knowingly. "Then he gave you a weapon, without realizing it." Her words hung in the air for a long moment. She reached across the desk, her hand steady on the old leather cover. "One day your silence will echo louder than all the noise they make about you." The room went still. I didn't know if she meant it as prophecy or encouragement, but something inside me cracked open just a little. After she left, I stood by the window again, coffee in hand. Snowflakes swirled in the gray light, disappearing before they touched the ground. By spring, Aurora had its first project, a mentorship program for high school girls interested in STEM. I borrowed folding chairs from a neighbor, wrote curriculum by hand, and bought cheap pastries from the corner bakery. When the girls arrived, the room filled with nervous laughter and wide-eyed excitement. "Science isn't about being perfect," I told them. "It's about curiosity, about trying when you're not sure anyone believes in you." They nodded, and for a second I saw myself in all of them, awkward, hopeful, desperate to prove we belonged. When the last student left that evening, I walked to the whiteboard and wrote in big letters, "Aurora, the light we build." I stood back and smiled. The marker squeaked as it dried the smell of cheap coffee still hanging in the air. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was chasing approval. I was building something bigger than that, something that didn't need permission. Outside, the city lights flickered through the snow. The world was still dark, but I finally had proof that dawn existed, and that maybe, just maybe, I was the one who could bring it. By 2023, Aurora had become bigger than I ever imagined. We had offices in 3 states, dozens of community programs, and partnerships with universities that once ignored my emails. The walls of our Denver headquarters were covered in photographs: women starting businesses, kids in STEM labs, families standing in front of new homes. For the first time, it felt like we were finally being seen for what we'd built, not for where we came from. Then, one morning, my assistant ran into my office holding her phone. "You should see this," she said. The headline hit me before I could breathe. Aurora Impact, charity or PR, stunt. Below it, my photo. Standing at a podium, smiling. A paragraph accusing Aurora of inflating donation numbers, of turning human suffering into branding. And at the bottom, the byline, Rachel Foster. The name was a punch. Rachel had once worked for Monroe Development Group, my father's empire. She'd handled press during his last scandal, then disappeared from Denver after the fallout. My first thought wasn't anger. It was familiarity. The same invisible hand that had shaped my life since childhood was pushing again. I stared at the article, my throat dry. My name was everywhere now, but not the way I'd ever wanted. "My name's in print," I said quietly. Just not for the reason I dreamed of. We called an emergency meeting. James Porter, my lawyer and oldest friend from Berkeley, leaned forward across the conference table. "If this is your father's doing, and I'm betting it is, he's coming after your credibility. Once he questions that everything you've built becomes rumor. Maya, now our communications director said we can issue a statement, maybe a legal notice to demand a retraction." James shook his head. "That's playing defense. You fight fire with sunlight, release the numbers, show everything." He was right. Silence might have been my strength before, but this wasn't about pride. It was about the people Aurora served. By evening, I decided, we'll hold a press conference. Tomorrow. Invite everyone. CNN too. Let them see the truth for themselves. James raised an eyebrow. "You're sure you want that circus? I've lived through worse circuses," I said. At least this time, I'm the one holding the mic. The next day, the building buzzed with reporters. The air outside shimmered with camera flashes. Rachel Foster arrived with her crew, her red lipstick sharp as a blade. She looked exactly the same as she had 10 years ago, composed, ambitious, and hungry for scandal. When I stepped to the podium, I felt the old nervous tremor in my hands, but I also felt something steadier underneath control. "Good morning," I said. "There's been talk about what Aurora is, what it stands for, and who it benefits. So let's talk about it." I pulled up the first slide. Open financial reports verified by an independent auditor. Every dollar we receive and every project we fund is accounted for here. We're not a PR firm. We're a promise. Rachel raised her hand, her voice slicing through the room. "Claire, if your work is as transparent as you claim, why are so many of your donors also business rivals of your father's?" There it was, the real story she wanted. Because I said, unlike him, I don't ask people who they are before helping them. She smirked. "And the reason you started this foundation, personal redemption or revenge," I took a breath. "You want the truth." I started Aurora because I was once the person they ignored. Because I know what it's like to be told you don't belong. And I made a promise to myself that no one else would feel that way. Not in my world. The room went quiet. Cameras clicked. Somewhere in the back, I saw Eleanor Pierce, watching her expression proud and sad, all at once. The conference lasted 40 minutes. By the time it ended, my throat was raw, but I hadn't lost my composure once. Outside, reporters swarmed for quotes. I gave none. That night, I watched the news from my apartment. My father's face filled the TV screen, framed by the Monroe Group logo behind him. He spoke with that same calm authority he'd always used to make lies sound like truth. "My family," he said, "has no connection to Aurora Impact Foundation. Their work is independent of us. We wish them the best." It wasn't a denial. It was a surgical cut. Enough distance to let me bleed alone. I leaned back on the couch, the flickering light from the TV casting shadows on the walls. For a second, I felt 12 again. Small, unheard, standing in the corner, while he handed someone else the spotlight. But then I caught my own reflection in the dark window, older, steadier, unshakable. "He just signed his name under this war," I whispered. I turned off the TV, opened my laptop, and began typing an email to Eleanor. If they want noise, I'll let the truth speak louder. My fingers hesitated for a second before I hit send. Outside, the city was quiet, but I could feel something shifting in the air. The crack in the silence before a storm. Rachel Foster didn't stop. 2 days after the press conference, she published another article. This one, colder, sharper, and more dangerous. Aurora Impact's numbers don't add up. Where does the money really go? Her words crawled across every major news outlet before sunrise. The accusations were vague enough to spark curiosity, but bold enough to plant doubt. By the time I got to the office, reporters were already outside, their cameras pointed like rifles at the glass doors. Inside, the staff looked shell-shocked. Maya handed me a folder with trembling hands. "We traced it," she said. "The leak came from inside. Ethan Reed, our CFO, the man who'd managed our books for 6 years, who'd toasted our first $1 million donation with a cheap bottle of champagne, who'd been at my side since Aurora's beginning." I opened the folder. Bank transfers, payments from a shell company tied to Monroe Development Group. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was systematic. He'd sold our numbers, our transparency, to the man who'd once told me I'd fail before I began. James Porter burst through the door, his tie-loosened face red from the cold. "We can press charges," he said. "Corporate espionage, data theft. But if we go public now, the damage doubles before it heals." I shook my head. "No lawyers yet. First we contain it." He frowned. "Claire, CNN's already called. They're suspending the collaboration until you clear this." I looked past him to the window. Outside, the snow had started again, soft flakes drifting against the glass like ash. "Then I'll clear it," I said. "Myself." That night, the email came from CNN, an urgent summons to New York for a meeting with their producers. No one used the word crisis, but I could feel it between the lines. The next afternoon, I sat in the glass conference room at CNN headquarters. The skyline stretched behind me, sharp and cold, the city's lights already flickering in the early winter dusk. Naomi Brooks, the senior producer, sat across the table, arms folded. Her reputation preceded her. Brilliant, unsparing, allergic to drama. She didn't offer coffee. "Claire," she began. "You know why we called you here." I nodded. "You've read the article." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "We've read the numbers. We've seen the leak. If there's even a hint of financial misconduct, we can't have you hosting a live event tied to our brand." "I understand." She leaned forward. "So tell me, why should CNN trust you?" For a moment, I just sat there, letting the hum of the city fill the silence. I could hear the faint buzz of a printer somewhere down the hall, the murmur of distant voices. I reached into my bag and pulled out a binder. Because the truth doesn't need to shout. I opened it and slid it across the table. Independent audit reports for the last 3 fiscal years. Aurora's records. Every dollar tracked, verified by 2 separate firms. You can call them tonight. Naomi flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers. The air between us felt like static. I continued. If I were guilty, I'd be in hiding, not here. I built this organization on transparency because I know what it's like to be accused of something you didn't do. Rachel Foster was there sitting in the back of the room as a consultant, her pen tapping on her notepad. "Or maybe you built it because guilt makes great PR, she said smoothly. "Tell me, Claire, do you really think the public will trust a woman whose own father refused to acknowledge her?" Her words landed like ice water, deliberate and cruel. I looked at her steady. "I think the people who will believe me are the ones who've been ignored their whole lives, because they recognize the sound of truth when they hear it." The room went still. Naomi stopped flipping through the pages. After a moment, she closed the binder, sliding it back toward me. "I'll review everything with legal and accounting," she said. "If this holds up, the story dies here. But Claire, if there's even one more scandal, I can't protect you. Not from this, not from him." I met her gaze. "I've never asked anyone to protect me." Her expression softened slightly, almost imperceptibly. "You remind me of someone I used to be." She stood. "We'll be in touch." As the meeting ended, Rachel gathered her papers with a smirk. "Careful," she said quietly as she passed me. "You're getting good at sounding righteous. That's usually the last step before a fall." I didn't answer. I just watched her reflection in the glass wall as she walked away. Naomi lingered by the door. "Whoever's behind this," she said, "is scared of you. People don't spend this much money to ruin someone they don't fear." When I left the building, the evening air cut through my coat. The city was humming with life. Horns, laughter, the distant thrum of a subway below. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing it in. The weight on my shoulders felt like something I could finally hold, instead of something that crushed me. Back at the hotel, I dropped my bag on the bed, opened my laptop, and started typing. A new post this time on Aurora's public site. Full audit available. No fear of the truth. Before I hit publish, I paused. My father had always said that silence was weakness. But standing there in that quiet room, I realized silence could also be strategy, if you chose when to break it. The cursor blinked once, twice. Then I pressed send. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the city lights flickered like tiny sparks against the dark. The conference room on the top floor of Monroe Development Group felt colder than usual that morning. The skyline of Manhattan stretched behind the glass like a painting, sharp and distant. Richard Monroe sat at the head of the table, his suit perfectly pressed, a silver pen tapping against his notepad. The executives around him waited for him to speak. Victoria sat 2 seats down, twisting a pen between her fingers, the way she always did when she didn't want her nerves to show. Richard finally looked up. "We need to release a counter-report," he said. "Something that questions Aurora's integrity. Doesn't matter what's true. All that matters is doubt." Daniel Foster, the vice president, nodded immediately. "We can spin the leaked files, make it look like Claire's team buried certain donations, a few manipulated figures, just enough to shake investor confidence." Victoria froze. "If it's not true," Richard cut her off, his tone sharp. "In business, truth is a matter of timing. Whoever speaks first loses the advantage." She glanced down at her notepad, pretending to write something, but her hand had stopped moving. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioner. Richard continued outlining the strategy, contacts in media timing, who would leak the right sound bites, but her ears were ringing. "I used to admire my sister. She was everything I thought I needed to be. Polished, composed, untouchable. But as I imagined her sitting there in that sterile room, I wondered how many people had to stay silent so she could keep her crown as the perfect daughter." That night, Victoria drove home through the Manhattan fog, the city lights blurring through the windshield. Her husband had already gone to bed, the apartment spotless as always. She poured herself a glass of wine, turned on the TV, and the sound of my voice filled the room. It was a rerun of a local interview I'd done months earlier, talking about Aurora's mentorship program for women in science. "We don't just give them tools," I'd said on screen, smiling. "We give them permission to dream." Victoria stood still, glass halfway to her lips. The sound of the words lingered in the air. Permission to dream. She turned off the TV, her reflection faint on the dark screen eyes, wet but unreadable. Later that night, she drove back to the office. The building was empty, the security guard half asleep at the desk. Her heels echoed down the hallway as she made her way to her father's office. Inside, she turned on the lamp. The faint smell of his cologne still hung in the air. His desk was perfectly organized, folders labeled, pens aligned. She sat in his chair for a long time, staring at the city outside, the power of it all. Then she opened his laptop. The password hadn't changed, Monroe 1957. She navigated to a folder labeled Internal Reports. Hidden inside was an audio file titled Strategy Briefing, Confidential. She hesitated, then pressed play. Her father's voice filled the room, calm, confident, unshakably. "Certain. Transfer the funds through the Shell account. Make it look like Aurora's CFO took the money. If she fights, she'll look defensive. And once that happens, we win." Her hand flew to her mouth. The glass of wine she'd set on the desk tipped and rolled, spilling across the papers. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. She copied the file to a flash drive, hands trembling. Every sound in the building suddenly felt too loud. The hum of the vents, the ticking of the clock, her own heartbeat. By the time she reached the parking garage, her breathing had gone shallow. She sat in the car for nearly 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, debating. Her whole life had been built around loyalty, to the company, to him, to the family name. But this was something else. The next morning, James Porter received an anonymous email at his office in Denver. The subject line read, "For the truth." Attached was a single audio file and a note that said, "End this, for both of us." He called me an hour later. "You might want to hear this," he said. His voice was low, careful. When the recording began, I recognized my father's tone instantly. That calm authority that made people believe lies were strategy, not sin. I didn't speak for a long time after it ended. James asked, "Do you know who sent it?" I looked at the last line of the message again. For both of us. I have an idea, I said quietly. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city lights flickering outside. I thought about Victoria, the girl who'd worn pearls while I wore hand-me-downs, who'd always seemed to stand on the right side of our father's approval. For the first time, I didn't see her as the enemy. I saw her as another survivor of his empire, one who finally decided to stop protecting the man who built it. The air felt lighter somehow, but heavier too. The truth was a guerre and a weapon, and as I listened to the recording one more time, I realized something I'd never allowed myself to think before we weren't on opposite sides anymore. For the first time, she wasn't standing with him. 2 days before New Year's Eve, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop. CNN's press release had gone live. Aurora Impact Foundation founder Claire Monroe confirmed as host of Countdown for Hope. It was official. My face was everywhere on morning shows, social media feeds, even the homepage of the network. For a few minutes, I let myself breathe it in. The validation, the relief, the disbelief that I'd made it this far. Then came the storm. The first blow landed before noon. My father, sitting in his office slick suit and silver cufflinks catching studio light, appeared on Fox News. My daughter has made her own choices, he said smoothly. I wish her well, though. I do believe it's difficult for someone who's turned her back on her family to speak credibly about compassion. I didn't need to watch the rest. The headlines multiplied within minutes. Billionaire father questions daughter's integrity. By the time I got to the Aurora office, the internet was on fire. Comments piled under every post, every clip, every photo. Half of them were supportive. Words like inspiring trailblazer. The other half burned like acid. She's using the homeless for attention. Nepotism. Pretending to be empathy. If she really cared, she'd give up her salary. Each word felt like glass, but I'd learned how to bleed without showing it. Eleanor showed up that afternoon, wrapped in a camel coat, holding a garment bag. She looked at me with that quiet, knowing expression of hers, and set it on my desk. Try it on, she said. Inside was a silver gown, simple but radiant, the fabric almost liquid in the light. It's the last one I wore on air, she said softly. When I retired, I promised myself I'd only pass it on. When I met someone who understood what it means to stand under the lights and still tell the truth. I laughed faintly. You sure it's not cursed? Only if you're afraid of being seen. She smiled. Let the light do the talking tomorrow night. Her words stayed with me. That evening, a text came in from an unknown number. For a moment, my chest tightened, thinking it might be him, but it wasn't. It was Victoria. Be careful. They're not done yet. I read it twice before replying. Thank you. No signature followed. But she didn't need one. I could almost see her standing at her window somewhere in New York, torn between two versions of herself. The next morning, I flew to New York with James and Naomi. The city was electric, full of the restless hum that only existed the week between Christmas and New Year's. The CNN building rose from the street like a tower of glass and noise. Inside, technicians were running cables, lights flickered across the main stage, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and nerves. Naomi Brooks, the producer, was pacing near the control booth. We'll do a full tech rehearsal, she said. Cameras 1 through 5 will track your entrance. No improvising. If there's any sign of trouble, any technical glitch or another leak, we cut to commercial. Understood? I nodded. Understood. But you won't have to cut. She paused, studying me. You're calm. That's either confidence or denial. Maybe both. I said, slipping on the headset. During the rehearsal, I stood beneath the blinding studio lights, reading lines from the teleprompter, watching my reflection appear on the monitor behind the cameras. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to CNN's Countdown for Hope. The words echoed through the studio, clean and powerful. I felt my heartbeat slow. For once, the light didn't feel like judgment. It felt like proof. Naomi's voice crackled in my ear. Good. Stay on that tone. Steady, warm, not sentimental. You're not selling pity. You're selling possibility. After the run-through, she joined me on stage, clipboard in hand. If something goes wrong, she said, lowering her voice. If your father releases something new, or the press digs up another headline, I will not hesitate to stop the broadcast. I can't afford a scandal live on air. I met her gaze. Then don't stop it. Let the light run its course. For a second, she didn't respond. Then she smiled, small but genuine. You really are your own storm, aren't you? That night, I checked into the hotel CNN, booked near Columbus Circle. From my room on the 32nd floor, the city stretched endlessly. a sea of glass and neon. I sat by the window with a cup of cold tea, watching taxis blur into streaks of yellow below. My laptop pinged with another article. Can Claire Monroe handle the spotlight? I closed it before reading a word. The hum of the city outside drowned out the noise in my head. I reached for the silver gown hanging by the closet. The fabric shimmered as it caught the lamplight. Eleanor's words played over and over in my mind. Let the light do the talking. I walked to the window again. Times Square glittered in the distance, already half covered with the scaffolding for the countdown stage. Somewhere out there, my father was probably celebrating early, surrounded by people who said yes to him for a living. Tomorrow night, I would stand under those same lights he once said I'd never deserve. I whispered to my reflection in the glass. Tomorrow I'll stand where they said I didn't belong. The city lights flickered like 1,000 tiny cameras recording a truth only I could feel this time. I wasn't the one in the shadows. The air backstage smelled like hairspray, metal, and nerves. Cables snaked across the floor, stagehands shouted cues, and the steady hum of the countdown clock echoed from the monitors. 30 minutes to showtime. My reflection glowed red in the studio light. Every flicker of the countdown clock pulsing like a heartbeat in the glass. Naomi's voice cut through the noise. "Claire," she said, walking fast, phone in hand. Her face was pale tight. "We have a problem." I turned. "What kind of problem?" She held out the phone. The screen showed an anonymous email, the subject line in bold, "Aurora's funds misused. Exclusive evidence." Attached were fabricated spreadsheets and fake donation trails, so expertly forged they almost looked real. "Someone sent this to half the press corps in Manhattan," Naomi said. "It's already spreading on social media. They're saying your foundation used charity money for private events." For a second, it felt like the floor fell away beneath me. Eleanor appeared from the hallway, her gray hair catching the stage lights. She read the message over Naomi's shoulder and cursed softly under her breath. "This has Richard's fingerprints all over it." Naomi looked at me. "We can still pull you off the broadcast. I'll have Mark cover the entire segment. You can release a statement tomorrow." I felt everyone's eyes on me. The producers, the assistants, the stage crew pretending not to listen. My mouth was dry, but my voice came out steady. "If I leave now, he wins. If I stay, at least the world gets to see my face when I speak for myself." Eleanor put a hand on my shoulder. "If you back down now, they'll remember your silence longer than any rumor." I nodded slowly. "I'm done being afraid of being wrong." The director's voice boomed over the intercom. 15 minutes. I walked to the edge of the curtain and peeked out at the stage. The massive screens above Times Square glowed in waves of blue and gold. Thousands of people filled the streets, bundled in scarves, holding signs counting the seconds to midnight. The lights looked like stars trying to outshine each other. The studio audience buzzed with energy, faces flushed with excitement. In the front row, I spotted Maggie Torres. The young woman Aurora had helped 2 years earlier, now in a clean coat and bright scarf. She was holding a handmade sign, "Thank you, Aurora." Her smile hit me harder than any headline ever could. I closed my eyes, feeling the hum of the room, the vibrations from the floorboards. For years, I'd been told I wasn't strong enough, that my success depended on someone else's permission. Now I stood 30 feet from a live camera that would beam my voice to millions of people who'd never met me but might need to hear me. If I failed tonight, they'd say I told you so. But if I stood my ground, I'd be speaking for every woman who'd ever been told to sit down. Naomi's headset crackled. 2 minutes, people. Let's make history clean. I exhaled, slowly smoothed the silver gown Eleanor had given me, and stepped closer to the stage. Eleanor caught my hand just before I moved past her. "You don't have to outshine them," she said. "You just have to stand long enough for them to see you." The countdown hit 1 minute. The sound crew gave the final cue. The lights dimmed and a red bulb blinked above the main camera. Naomi whispered into her mic. "We're live in 5, 4. I felt the heat of the lights against my skin. The microphone cool in my hand. 3, 2. The stage doors opened. I walked out into the glare of it all. The noise, the color, the pressure. My heart pounded, but my voice didn't shake. "Good evening, everyone." I began, eyes fixed on the camera lens. Tonight isn't about perfection. My voice echoed through the studio and onto the streets below, amplified by the speakers across Times Square. It's about hope for those who've been left out, left behind, and left unseen. The crowd outside cheered, though I could only hear the muffled sound of it through the glass. The studio itself went utterly still. Every face turned toward me. Some curious, some doubtful, some already believing. I caught sight of Maggie in the front row again. Her eyes glistening, her sign trembling slightly in her hands. In that moment, the noise in my head, the headlines, the rumors, the echoes of my father's voice, finally went quiet. The lights burned brighter. The red camera light blinked once more. And I knew, as the teleprompter scrolled past my next line, that the words didn't matter as much as the fact that I was standing there saying them. The director's voice whispered faintly in my earpiece. "We're live, Claire. You're doing great." For the first time all night, I smiled, and just like that, the fear dissolved into light. The lights outside the CNN studio bled into the night, every color reflecting off the glass like liquid fire. I could hear the muffled roar of the crowd beyond Times Square, thousands of voices blending into one unstoppable rhythm. 10 seconds to midnight, Mark Lewis, the main host, leaned toward me, his voice steady but exhilarated. "Ready for history." "Claire." I smiled, my hands clasped around the microphone. "Always." The massive clock began its descent. 10:98. The noise swelled until the ground itself seemed to shake. Cameras flashed, confetti glittered like snowfall, and above it all, fireworks erupted from the rooftops, painting the sky in crimson and gold. Maggie Torres walked onto the stage a little shy under the lights, but glowing with quiet pride. She held a giant check with trembling hands, $2.5 million raised for shelters across New York. The audience roared. Mark gestured to her. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what tonight's about. Real stories, real people, real hope." I looked at Maggie, her smile trembling. "Thank you, Claire," she said into the mic, "for giving people like me a reason to believe again." I wanted to say something, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just took her hand and raised it toward the crowd as the countdown hit its final beat. 3, 2, 1. Fireworks exploded overhead, thunder without warning, bursting into streaks of silver and blue that lit up the faces around me. The energy was electric, unstoppable. For a heartbeat, I forgot about the rumors, the betrayal, the silence of my father's house. I'd waited my whole life to stand in the light and not flinch. I could feel my own voice in my head rising above the chaos. I've lived my whole life waiting to see this kind of light. When the music faded and the cameras cut to commercial, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. The stage emptied in slow waves, technicians, moving equipment hosts, shaking hands, confetti, settling like a soft snowfall across the floor. I stepped backstage, the noise of the crowd still echoing faintly through the walls. It was almost peaceful now, like the world had finally exhaled. Someone handed me a towel and a bottle of water, but I barely noticed. I sat down in the nearest chair, still in my silver gown, and stared at my reflection in the dressing room mirror. The makeup was beginning to fade, the mascara smudged at the corners of my eyes. Then my phone buzzed. At first, it was just one vibration, then another, then more. I picked it up. The screen lit with missed calls, 510 2050. By the time the scrolling stopped, there were 87. Every single one from Dad. For a moment, I didn't move. The number glared back at me like a confession. I could almost hear his voice in my mind, sharp, certain, commanding. Only now there was something else beneath it, panic. I set the phone down on the vanity table, face up, the screen still glowing. "Silence," I whispered, is still the loudest answer. The door creaked open. Naomi stepped in, headset around her neck, clipboard still in hand. She was grinning for the first time in days. "Claire, she said you did it." I turned toward her. "Did what?" She laughed softly. "CNN just got confirmation from finance. The broadcast raised a record-breaking total, 2.5 million. You broke the network's charity record." Her voice softened. "You've just given thousands of people a place to sleep tonight." I blinked back tears I didn't want to shed. "It's not for me," I said quietly. "It's for the ones who never get called by name." Naomi reached out, resting her hand on my shoulder. "You realize what just happened out there, right? They tried to bury you, and you turned it into a resurrection on live television." I smiled faintly. "I just told the truth." She squeezed my shoulder once, then left me alone again. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of noise that didn't need to be said, of words that finally didn't matter. I stood and walked toward the balcony door at the far end of the hallway. The night air hit me as soon as I stepped outside. The city below was still alive with color. Fireworks bursting over the Hudson, neon lights rippling through the buildings. Confetti floated through the air like fragile snowflakes refusing to land. I leaned against the railing, the wind tugging at my hair, catching the silver shimmer of my gown. My reflection in the glass door behind me looked older, stronger, freer. For the first time in years, I felt no pull toward that old house in Indiana. No ache for a father's approval. No hollow space that needed filling. Just light. Cold, sharp, and endless. Somewhere inside, my phone vibrated again, another missed call lighting the screen. I didn't look this time. I lifted my face toward the fireworks and whispered. They finally saw me. The sound of laughter from the streets rose up to meet the echo of the last explosion. And for one breathtaking second, the world seemed perfectly, brilliantly still. 3 weeks after the broadcast, the world looked different. The snow in Denver had started to melt, leaving gray slush in the streets, and the city had gone quiet again after the chaos of the holidays. I was back in my office at Aurora, trying to settle into something that felt like normal when the headlines began to roll in. SEC launches. Investigation into Monroe Development Group for charity fraud. Former insiders allege Hope Build Fund. Misappropriated millions. Rachel Foster reports our source is confirmed to be a member of the Monroe family. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen, unsure whether to breathe or laugh. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, my father's company had used philanthropy as camouflage, feeding off other people's goodwill. Now, under the same light that once burned me, he was finally visible. On the other side of the country, in a glass tower above Manhattan, Richard Monroe's empire was unraveling. I could imagine him in that corner office, the one with the mahogany desk and skyline view, surrounded by the sound of ringing phones and the static of panic. "Sir, the SEC is requesting documents for review," one of his assistants stammered. "Sir, investors are pulling out. Sir, the stocks dropped 14% in 2 days." He would stay silent, his jaw tight, his fingers tapping against the desk in that steady rhythm I'd grown up hearing. Control had always been his language, but that day, even his silence couldn't translate authority. When his lawyer came in with another report, he waved him off and reached for the remote. The screen flickered to life, my face filling the frame. I was standing at a podium in Denver speaking about Aurora's new housing initiative. Our next goal, I was saying, is to move beyond temporary shelters, because giving someone a roof isn't enough if the foundation underneath them is still shaking. He didn't change the channel. Maybe for the first time he listened. Karma isn't a punch. It's light seeping through the cracks, finding the places where the lies start to rot. That afternoon, the door to his townhouse opened quietly. Victoria stepped in, still in her navy coat, her hair tied back. She'd aged 10 years in the past 3 weeks. The place smelled of whiskey and old smoke. He looked up from his chair, startled, but too proud to show it. "You shouldn't be here," he said. She didn't answer right away. She placed a small envelope on the coffee table in front of him. "I had to come." He frowned. "What is this?" "The documents," she said. "The ones I gave them. The recording. It was me." His face didn't move, but his hands gripped the armrests. "You destroyed this family," she shook her head. "You did that when you started lying in its name." He leaned forward. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Her voice cracked slightly. "Yes, for the first time I know exactly what I've done." There was a long silence. The sound of the city outside barely reached them. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said. Eyes wet, but I chose the truth. He didn't look at her, didn't speak. His shoulders sagged under the weight of something too heavy for even his pride to carry. When she left, the envelope was still sitting there on the table unopened. 2 days later, I came into the Aurora office and found a thick, cream-colored envelope waiting on my desk. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Sharp, deliberate, almost mechanical. Inside was a cashier's check for $1 million and a note written on plain white paper. "I'm sorry. Dad." The pen had pressed hard into the paper, the kind of pressure that came from a man who'd never apologized in his life. I stared at it for a long time. The words didn't feel like reconciliation. They felt like surrender. I folded the note and the check back into the envelope and slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk. The same drawer that held my old leather notebook from childhood. The one where it all started. One chapter ends, I whispered. The sun dipped low over the Denver skyline, spilling gold across the office. I leaned back in my chair and let it wash over me, the quiet hum of the heater filling the room. Across the wall was a framed photograph of my team, the Aurora staff standing shoulder to shoulder after our first national grant. Behind them, on the whiteboard, someone had written our motto in black marker. Build light where they see darkness. I stood, walking closer, tracing the words with my eyes. The letters had started to fade over time, but the meaning hadn't. For so long I'd been fighting against his shadow, defining myself by what I wasn't. But maybe this was what winning looked like. Not revenge, not applause, but the moment the darkness finally stopped mattering. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows softly. Somewhere across the city, a siren wailed and faded. I turned off the lights, leaving only the glow from the skyline to fill the room. The envelope in the drawer stayed where it was, untouched, uncashed, unnecessary. Justice didn't need to scream. Sometimes it just needed time. February 2025 came quietly like a sunrise you almost missed if you weren't looking for it. The city felt lighter that week, or maybe it was just me. Denver had thawed, the snow turning to silver slush, and for the first time in years, I didn't wake up thinking about the next fight. The invitation to New York sat on my desk for days before I opened it again. Aurora Impact Foundation is honored with the Humanitarian of the Year Award. When I arrived at the Waldorf Astoria, the chandelier light glowed warm against the marble floors, and people in tuxedos moved like they were part of a slow, choreographed dance. I'd been in rooms like this before, always as someone's guest, never as the reason the room existed. This time my name was printed on the program right beneath the headline. Eleanor met me in the lobby, her hair swept back, her smile calm and proud. "Ready for your next chapter?" she asked. I nodded. "It feels strange," I said, adjusting the silver bracelet she'd given me before the CNN show. "Winning something for just being myself." "That's the hardest thing to win," she said. "Now go remind them why you earned it." The ballroom lights dimmed, and the applause rolled like thunder when they called my name. I walked to the stage, heart steady. The weight of everything that had led me here pressing softly against my ribs. The white lights hit me as soon as I stepped behind the podium. It was the same kind of light I'd once feared, the kind that exposed, that demanded. But now it felt different. It felt deserved. I smiled at the audience. A few years ago someone told me I didn't belong at their table. So I built my own and left the doors open for anyone who needed a seat. The crowd was silent for a moment, and then the sound came. Applause that grew and grew until it filled the room. I caught sight of faces in the front row, politicians, CEOs, artists, but my eyes stopped at two people near the aisle. My mother sat with her hands clasped, her eyes shining. Beside her, Victoria looked down for a moment, then up again, her expression soft, fragile. She smiled at me. Small, but real. I kept talking, though my voice was no longer entirely my own. This foundation was built by people who knew what it felt like to be unseen, but tonight every single one of them is visible, not because of me, but because they refused to stop believing that light belongs to them too. When I finished, the audience rose to their feet. The applause was deafening, and I stood there letting it wash over me, not like victory, but like release. After the ceremony, I moved through the crowd of cameras and congratulations until I saw her. Victoria standing near the exit. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then she stepped forward and pulled me into a hug. It wasn't long or dramatic, just the kind that held everything words couldn't repair. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. I nodded into her shoulder. "You too." When she let go, Mom came forward, brushing a stray hair from my face. "Your father would have been..." She hesitated, searching for the right word. "He would have been watching." I smiled faintly. "That's enough." Outside, the February air bit at my cheeks as I slipped through the hotel doors. New York stretched before me, all glass and noise and promise. I walked a few blocks toward the CNN building, the one whose lights had once terrified me, and rode the elevator up to the rooftop balcony. The city below pulsed with motion. Taxis darting through intersections, streetlights blinking in rhythm. People still chasing midnight. I leaned on the railing, the same silver gown from that New Year's night, catching the glow of the skyline. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's letting go of the need to be defined by someone else's silence. I looked out over the city at the thousands of lights that looked like a constellation built by human hands. Somewhere beneath them were the women Aurora had helped, the families who had roofs again, the students who'd found scholarships with our names stamped in the corner. A soft breeze swept across the rooftop, carrying the faint echo of laughter from a street below. I closed my eyes, breathing it in. The air smelled like winter trying to leave. Then, from somewhere on the east side of the river, a late burst of fireworks went off. Tiny sparks of red and gold scattering across the sky, a celebration arriving just a little behind schedule. I smiled, whispering into the wind. Sometimes being seen is the loudest kind of justice. For a long moment, I just stood there, watching the colors fade. And when they did, I didn't feel the need to chase what came next. If this story found its way to you, stay for the next one. There's always another beginning waiting to be built.